Welcome to the third composition masterclass, where I take a look at pieces you've sent me, and I try to give some advice that'll help as many budding composers as possible. First up is Mikko Sirola's 3 Waltzes for solo piano. I really like all 3 of these pieces. I can definitely hear some kind of French influence, like its equal parts Satie and Ravel, and those are 2 of my favorite French composers. I think they work really well all together as a set as well, not just as individual waltzes. A couple of things stood out to me though. In the first waltz, stemming stuff to be played by the left and right hand as one big chord isn't advisable, so I'd stem the melodic line up and the chordal accompaniment down. This could go for pretty much any instance where the melody and accompaniment come fairly close together. The MIDI rendering kind of blurs this at certain points because, well, it's MIDI. Also, once you get to about 3 ledger lines, it's time to start thinking about 8VA or 8VB markings. There are very few pianists who prefer to read ledger lines. In the second waltz, there are a few small tweaks. The mysteriously low quarter rest in measure 17, or the kind of confusing sea of ties from 21 to 22. So the C and F are held over, and there's an E-flat augmented chord in the downbeat. But if you've got the pedal down, couldn't you just eliminate the tied over notes, stem the downbeat down, and stem the upper melody up? Seems like it'd make it a lot clearer. In the third waltz, there's a common rhythmic notation error in the first system. Generally, you don't stick long note values on the and of a certain beat. This is not as clear to read as an eighth tied to a half would be, because an eighth tied to a half lines things back up on the second beat. 1/4 time has its uses, but I'm not seeing a clear-cut reason for it here. It's easier just to make one of the surrounding measures 4/4. Also, props for at least trying to make use of this funky fermata, but there's a reason that fermatas like these just didn't stick around when the system of fermatas of various lengths was first used in the middle of the 20th century. There's just not a huge need for that kind of differentiation when the length of a fermata is A, inherently up to interpretation, and B, largely context dependent. Considering that there are no fermatas on either eighth and the left hand, I can only assume that this means that you want a ritardando into this measure, and then an even more pronounced ritardando on that beat in particular. Perhaps you can make this a bar of 2/4, double all the note values, but put the a tempo on that measure instead of the measure after. There are many more ways to do this than trying to put an unusual fermata just on the right hand, because you'd need to equal the fermatas in the left and right hand if you want to be very specific about it. In the final system, the lower notes should always stem down and the upper notes should stem up, even if it seems counterintuitive. Visually, it's the best way to distinguish between different parts. If two voices are going on at the same time, the upper ones stem up and the lower ones stem down. Next up, we have two pieces by Canadian student composer Daniel Bazin. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. First up is an arrangement of the British Grenadiers for concert band, of which there are only 27 measures. Its incompleteness keeps me from commenting too much on it directly, but I can speak to writing for concert band, specifically amateur concert bands. Because concert bands, or wind ensembles, whatever you want to call them, are largely going to be amateur groups, keeping in mind the level for which you're writing is arguably the most important thing in writing for wind ensembles at all. And it goes beyond making sure the rhythms and techniques aren't too taxing. It actually impacts your orchestrations. The thicker and more doubled or tripled the line is, the more secure it's going to sound, because each individual player is backed up by a good chunk of the entire ensemble. This leads to what I call the band sound effect. The more you double wind and brass instruments, the more you get a generic wind band sound. Yet, doubling and tripling is the only way to have amateur groups perform your music with any degree of accuracy. It's a catch-22 where Mahler-esque shifts and changes in color, basically treating the colors of a wind ensemble like you treat the colors of a professional orchestra, aren't accessible to the vast majority of groups looking for wind band repertoire. Finding a sweet spot between interesting orchestrations and stable performances can be very difficult, not just at the high school level, but on the collegiate level as well. I made the mistake of going for a Mahler-esque orchestration in a wind ensemble piece one time, and while I stand by my solos and shifts in color, I still think the orchestration of the piece is pretty good, the number of exposed solos and general lack of doubling, tripling, and quadrupling led to some not great performances, and that's because I didn't, at the time, understand the psychology behind the level of group for which I was writing. The second piece is a solo piano work called Hypnagogia, which was, according to Daniel, deemed unplayable due to some of the stretches on the right hand, and oh wow, yeah, I'm not saying there's no one in the world who could play these major tenths, but you have to find a pianist with an unusually large hand span to pull it off. I'm curious as to why you did that. The left hand's not actually doing all that much. If you want that level of activity in the right hand and that octave in a third sonority, there are some more effective ways and more idiomatic ways to pull this off. One would be to have an octave tremolo and then have the left hand cross over to play some D sharps above it all. You could add some rhythmic variety because it seems like the constant tremoloing would just get old after a little bit. A couple more things, and I touched on this a little bit earlier with the other piece. If you have a fermata, it has to be expressed in all the parts. So when you have, for instance, consecutive fermatas in measure 13, you need at least one fermata on a rest in the left hand to even it out. The octave up treble clef isn't unheard of, but the only composer I know of who used it with any consistency was Kaikhosru Sorabji, who really isn't the kind of composer you want to model if you're looking to write visually idiomatic piano music. Sorabji's scores are difficult to sight read for many reasons, and while his use of this clef isn't the primary reason they're difficult to read, they're one of them, because they're not standard, and most softwares don't do a great job at distinguishing them. At least in many of Sorabji's scores, there's a big 1 or even 2 next to the treble clefs to remind you that it is an octave or 2 octaves up. But in this case, the 8 is bold, but it's tiny. This kind of thing is more suited to the piccolo, where the ottava marking isn't the primary focus, and it's just there as a simple reminder that the sounding pitch happens to be an octave up. Finally, mixing sharps and flats within a measure has its place, but if a measure can be written without having to do so, that is much preferable. Let's take a look at measure 19, where a B major 7th goes to a B flat half diminished 7th. Why not respell this as an A sharp half diminished 7th? You stay in sharps, and you avoid having to go from reading F sharp to F flat. A sharp half diminished would mean that each note of the first chord descends by a step, and everything stays in sharps, and you don't have to read F flat. Instead, you have A sharp, C sharp, E, and G sharp. Personally, I think this might be an interesting challenge for you to take this piece and expand it to a fuller ensemble. I don't know what ensemble it would be, but I'm just thinking that the tremolo texture that pervades the piece is going to get old. Not just because it's the same tremolo throughout the entire piece, because the piece is pretty short at the end of the day, but it's just that it's the same instrument, and part of the nature of things getting boring is not necessarily the same thing, but the fact that you're hearing it with the same timbre. So if you expanded it and shifted it off between instruments, say you have some string tremolos, you could also do the same thing on a harp, you could do it on marimba or vibraphone, you could have some flutter-tonguing and flutes and clarinets. There are plenty of options here. I'm not telling you exactly how you should or should not expand this, but I'm just saying there's a lot more potential here if you are really obsessed with this tremolo idea to expand it into a piece that's beyond just solo piano. Thanks to everyone who submitted pieces. Again, if you submitted a piece that's been featured and want further advice or lessons, shoot me an email. If you've not been featured yet and want to, well, shoot me an email. All roads lead to email. Don't be shy.